Hello. Um, all right, so I'm going to talk about like Black history, Black history and achievement, like Black ancient history and African ancient history. Um, there's often like a war raging and on the internet and elsewhere between, um, basically against Black historians and Black people and Black history. And there's a tendency that I've seen, certainly on Facebook and I think in general, for like at least certain segments of like every other uh, kind of, nationality or group to like try to join forces against Black people, and be and all these like basically other oppressed people like get to feel like they're on the winning team because they're getting joining with the whitey to trash Black people. So it's a sad, pathetic thing that they do, and it's fucked up. And so like a lot of the contact I have with that is to do with pre-Columbian transoceanic contact, because I study that. I have a Facebook group by that name, and so we show evidence and study the pre-Columbian transoceanic contact by various groups. I mean, the only pre-Columbian contact group that has generally been accepted by white people is the Vikings. That okay, that's accepted, and they say that there's like evidence for that, that the Vikings came here before Columbus, and now they're saying that, or at least some scientists are acknowledging that there's evidence that South Americans crossed the Pacific before Columbus and intermarried with the Polynesians, interbred with them. But in terms of the question of a Black presence and Black influence in America, and African influence and presence in America before Columbus, that certainly does not have any kind of widespread acceptance in general. I mean, there are a lot of Black people who do know about that and do talk about that. But in general, like most of the world is pretty much denies that and is against it. Although, from earliest times, there were, other scholars who acknowledged it. I mean, the founder of pre-Columbian anthropology, you could say, or at least like kind of the main founder of Mesoamerican anthropology, which was Humboldt, like Alexander von Humboldt. He was like a polymath. I think he knew a lot of languages. He was a cultured person. He's from a time when being educated actually meant something. Like it meant you had it meant you were as immersed and well grounded as possible in like all of the knowledge that existed, basically. And so when he came to Mexico in the whenever it was, the 1700s or something, he immediately recognized the Egyptian influence there and wrote about it. So that's the founding hypothesis. But the modern quote unquote anthropologists tend to be against that. And so I think racism is the reason, hatred, bigotry, that that people just can't stand to acknowledge any kind of Black or African achievement in the world. And, it's funny to think that in the 1700s and the 1800s, actually even like white people were not as insecure as they are now, because white people were able to acknowledge that it was laughable to think that they were the first to cross the ocean. Like they assumed, they knew that, other people had crossed the ocean before them, and they saw the obvious influence in like, Mesoamerica and elsewhere of different old world cultures. And, it's only modern white people that are so bigoted and white supremacist and insecure that they can't even acknowledge that. Like they kind of can't really acknowledge that any non-white person has ever achieved anything anywhere, but they certainly can't acknowledge this. And so all this nonsense, like the image of the US and like of white Westerners as being all like enlightened and post-racial and whatever, like even the ones who like give lip service to that, they're mostly fakers. There's very few, I think there's very few steadfast allies, white allies of anybody. I mean, there's some kind of, allies on this or that, but thoroughgoing, steadfast allies, I don't see it. I don't see much of that. So just to talk about the evidence for why, see, I'm going to close my window. They're doing construction out here always. Let's see. All right. So, I mean, in terms of evidence of that, you can check my article, if you want to look at the details. I have an article at medium.com, Rowan Millar. It's called the quote unquote old world, or America and the quote unquote old world are each other's underworlds. And the cover photo of that is a map of America from, an 5,500-year-old African map of America, which also shows Western Africa and Eastern Asia, and Greenland, which I think was basically considered part of America. And so, that, like, I was just watching a video where they're trying to, like, some guy was trying to debunk the Afrocentrics and claim that the Olmecs of Mexico, the kind of pre-Mayan or, ancient Mexican civilization, that they were not African or whatever. Because, from earliest times, anthropologists have thought of the Olmecs as having been at least partly African, like that a lot of the Olmec heads, or, Black people, like that a lot of the, there's these huge stone heads that were carved by the Olmecs in Mexico, and a lot of them have features that look very much like like Black African features. And so, for hundreds of years, I think people have pointed to those as evidence of Black presence in America before Columbus, and before the Aztecs. And so, there's a debate about that. Some people say, like, well, that those features are actually, from, that they just happen to be similar to Black facial features, and that actually it's just a certain type of Amerindian phenotype, morphology. And I mean, it's hard to say exactly, you know, for each carving or whatever, what it exactly is. I mean, it is true that there are different phenotypes of, you know, especially maybe Polynesians and some other groups that have similarities to that. But I mean, I would argue that in a very real way, those people were black too, and those people were black Africans too, and a lot of them had, you know, afros, and, you know, so I think to a large extent the world was black, you know, in ancient times. And I mean, whiteness itself only seems to have began as a you know, seems to at least have only spread about, you know, starting about 7,000 years ago or so, and then steadily spread out. But, you know, the world was basically black. And but so you know, people say like, oh, you know, they dismiss the idea that the Olmecs could have been part African. And part of what they use, like in this video I was watching, they were using DNA, or one guy was trying to use DNA to say it, because they said that even though there is no DNA from the Olmecs, like the ancient Olmecs, there's been no like Olmec fossil that's had its DNA sequenced, as far as I know, or as far as they knew in the video even, that you can extrapolate based on, or recapitulate, which I didn't even know that word in that context, I guess biological context. You can reconstitute the genome of the Olmecs using the modern Mexican genome, or, you know, which is pretty problematic, pretty stupid, honestly. Like, I mean, to some extent it's true. Like, I'm sure that, you know, modern Mexicans who are, you know, mestizo or more towards the native, or or modern, you know, Mexican Amerindian groups, I'm sure they probably do have a lot of ancestry going, you know, that far back in America. But to then assume, therefore, that they were the only people there, or that there was no lineage that ever diverged from them, or, you know, it's nonsense. That's not scientific. And you know, even in the video, the more scientific of the two commentators basically acknowledged that we don't know. You know, like in terms of DNA, there's so many unknowns. You know, but so many people just want to use DNA to totally dismiss it, because they say, and even this guy was saying, he's like, well, African DNA is really distinctive, so he said, like, as far as I know, we haven't seen it, or whatever. I think Clyde Winters has actually done some good work on the DNA front, and you know, knows more about that than I do, and he's shown that there actually may be some evidence of, you know, African DNA in America. But, you know, as I'm not like really such a geneticist, but I can just say that, you know, even a lot of this stuff is very like DNA. It's a bit of guesswork, in the sense that, like, you know, they can say this DNA is similar to that DNA. It seems like they might be descended from them. But like, even he was even, you know, the kind of scientist on the video was even calling it like a hypothesis, you know, the Bering Strait, the idea that, you know, the people came over in the Bering Strait from Siberia 10,000 years ago during the Ice Age. And, you know, so it's like so much is kind of guesswork and inference and probabilities. But so, whereas something that is not, you know, they think, you know, like all the haters on all the people that hate on like Black history and whatever, and Black historians, like they really love DNA. Like they always want to hang their hat on like DNA evidence, and that's how they can, and then they always trash anybody that disagrees with them, and they say we don't have DNA evidence on our side. But the thing is, like, DNA evidence is very, it's not, especially at this stage in DNA science, it's not to the level where they can just like, conclusively prove that this or that group didn't live in the Americas just by studying some modern Mexican genomes. But, or even maybe to know like completely exactly who is descended from Siberians, even that, they could turn out that they just had a similar genome to the, I'm just saying there are a lot of variables and a lot of unknowns in DNA, and a lot of it is more about probabilities than certainties. And a lot of that then has to do with how you interpret the probabilities, or how you interpret the data to arrive at this or that probability. But in terms of something that I think is solid evidence, like irrefutable evidence, I mean, by people, to people who can see and can understand, the map of America from, Tomb 100 here at Hierakonpolis, Egypt, is proof, like solid proof that Africans were in America, 5,500 years ago when that map was made, and, probably much earlier, because, I mean, it was a map of the entire, Americas. So it may have been made over the course of like hundreds of years or even thousands of years. There's no telling when the map was originally made. All we know is that it was painted 5,500 years ago. So we don't have any evidence of that magnitude to prove that that really anybody else was in America at that time. I mean, I do believe that people did cross the Siberia to Beringia, and I do believe that many and maybe most Amerindians were descended from those people, at least in part, But I also believe that there were Africans and Black people, and even a lot of the Siberians were probably, essentially Black people in terms of color. And, I mean, it was, like I say, it was to a large extent a Black world in ancient times. Even Europeans were basically, dark-skinned before 7,000 years ago. So, but yeah, so this is like the map, and then there's a bunch of other maps like later, there's the Books of Two Ways, coffin text maps of America that are from a little before 4,000 years ago, and then on till they and their kind of descendant, funerary texts and art went on basically through Egyptian history, certainly to 3,000 years ago and later, I think. So there's, copious amounts of evidence for a continuous, certainly consistent, Egyptian prince, an African presence in America for the last, from 5,500 years ago and probably much earlier. And then, up until basically when the Egyptian civilization was, overthrown and corrupted by outsiders and whatever. So, and contrary to what a lot of these same haters want to believe, Egypt was also an African country, and Egyptians were black people too. Like the pharaohs were black; they were not like what you see in the movies, and they were not even what a lot of modern Egyptians look like. Like you see like a lot of ignorant people that just say, well, I'm sure that, the modern Arabs and the modern Egyptians and the modern this and that and the modern Mexicans are just exactly like their ancestors, and it would be silly to think otherwise. No, it would be silly to think that if you actually knew anything about it and you actually look at their art and their, history. Because if you go to the earliest paintings of Egypt, if you go to that map, go to the, Hierocompolitan map, Tomb 100, 5,500 years ago, 5,500 years old, it has a lot of depictions of people in it, basically Egyptian people, and they're black, they're very dark skinned, and, they're always depicted with curly hair, African hair. I was in Egypt recently, and they one of the people I talked to in Alexandria referred to curly hair as Egyptian hair. So this idea that Egyptians were white or Egyptians were, Middle Eastern, they say, oh no, they weren't black, they were Middle Eastern. It's like so pathetic. It's disgusting the way, like the depths to which a lot of people will sink just because it destroys them to think that any non-white person ever like achieved anything anywhere. And especially because they really know the truth, which is that, the black achievement was really epic and ancient, and at much of the time when Europe was relatively uncivilized, you could say, or more of a backwater. So, I don't think for people who have common sense and can at least to see the evidence that that I present and have shown, which again, you can check out in my Medium piece, medium.com. It's solid evidence. It's irrefutable. And there is no evidence like that for anyone else. So there's only really that kind of solid proof of African presence in America. And that's it. There's not anything like that for Asian, for European, for anybody else. Not even for Australian or for anybody else. So, this map has often been like mistaken for something else. It was kind of flipped around in a weird way that people didn't recognize it. But yeah, it's stupid that we even have to always go through this with all these haters, like all these people that make it like their life's work to just, debunk the quote unquote, what they call Afrocentric history, without having any clue what it's about. And, and like in the Americas, a lot of them, there's a kind of denial of how ancient Native Americans were not exactly the same as what are now considered to be like the Native Americans. Like there was, if you look at just the ancient art, you can see a variety of phenotypes, and many or most of them were very dark, depicted very dark, and often darker than, a lot of kind of modern day Amerindians, or like, maybe mixed mestizos or whatever. And so, yeah, there's just so much ignorance on this topic and so much nonsense on this topic. Another issue is like with Arabs, you know, because I think like the Middle East was largely black and you know, largely African, and you know, because there's a lot of even today, even after all the, you know, like you know, the kind of Indo-European conquests and the, you know, Vikings and Normans and Anglo-Saxons and everybody and the Franks and whatever, even still Europe, Western Europe still has a lot of, or, you know, a decent amount of like African genetic admixture, and the Middle East has significantly more, even still after, you know, a lot of the same type of conquest there from a lot of the same white people for the last like 1,000 or 2,000 years. So I think that, you know, it's clear that there were a lot of black people in the Middle East for thousands of years, and that, you know, that there's a good chance that either the whole population or a lot of the population there was essentially black up until, and I mean, a lot of still are, you know, like there's a lot of people in Yemen or really throughout the Arab world who are, you know, like they basically are black, like they have, you know, really curly African hair, dark skin, etc. And, you know, and like geologically in many ways, like the Middle East, like Arabia is kind of part of Africa. Like it's kind of part of the same bio region in many ways, and especially Palestine. I mean, Palestine is, in a way, it's part of the Sinai Peninsula, you know, like if you look at it, it's basically almost part of Egypt. And, you know, so that's another thing that like so many people laugh at that. Like when people say that, when there's black historians that are trying to educate people about this stuff, and they get like, you know, they get told off by all these like ignorant scum, and they get like laughed at by all these like idiots. And it's just like, I don't know how, it's like, yeah, requires so much patience to deal with these like haters. I mean, not that, you know, they get told off in turn, you know, which they well should, but it's like they have so much like standing, like so many people even that are like not really like jumping on their bandwagon necessarily, but it seems like so many people just like give them credit as if they know what they're talking about. I don't know. I just think a lot of Westerners and like white people, they just need to, they need their ego like coddled by everything, even by history. Like it's history. Like, do you need your ego coddled by math or like chemistry, or like, come on, it's just it's a field of study. You can study it, and just because you found out that, I don't know. I just think it's sad, you know, like especially for people that have as much power as they have right now, and for the last 1,000 years or more, basically controlling the world, but still to be so insecure and so jealous of everybody else's achievement that you have to whitewash Jesus, whitewash the Jews, whitewash the Middle East, whitewash all of North Africa, whitewash the Americas, and all the ancient gods have to be like these white gods, or it's just, I think it's disgusting. It shows like a depraved mentality. Anyway, so that's my spiel. I mean, I do have also evidence of Chinese influence in America in very early times, at least from like 4,000 years ago. So, and other influences like from Pakistan, India, and elsewhere, and the Middle East, like Iraq and stuff. But there's nothing so old as that 5,500-year-old map from Egypt. So yeah, the African precedence in American history, I think, is very solid in that sense. I mean, I'm not saying like who was first, who was, maybe there was always different groups. I don't know. I'm not gonna, that's not my expertise necessarily. I'm more about establishing what I can prove. And, Black Africans in America continuously from, like over the last like 6,000 years, basically, or no, I guess because it was 5,500. Yeah, it's 5,500 years ago. So yeah, like basically the last 6,000 years, there's been, a Black African influence and presence in America. And, like, I mean, I didn't always know that, but I found it out, and now I know. And it's cool. It's cool to know. It's awesome. And so I wish people could just acknowledge facts and not be so kind of emotional about all this stuff. All right. Thank you, and cheerio.